Okay, in this lesson, we will be looking at President Nixon's time in office. I'm going to go ahead and skip through these slides as we have already looked at them. So the Nixon years are 1969 to 1974. So we're going to take some background look at the election really briefly, and then we're going to talk about one main thing in President Nixon's time in office, and then leave the Watergate scandal until another lesson. Okay, so the election of 1968 was these four candidates running against one another. So Nixon, Humphrey, Kennedy, and Wallace. This Kennedy, yes, is related to John F. Kennedy. Unfortunately, Bobby Kennedy, who's running at this time for president, is assassinated by a Jordanian immigrant. So the Kennedys have a string of these things happen to their family, unfortunately. And so Bobby Kennedy is assassinated by an immigrant who disagreed with his views. He was actually leaving one of the debates that they had for the election in 1968. And he was killed in the kitchen of the location that they were having the debate. So they take the candidate out back, and somehow this person got in and assassinated him. Up in the upper right-hand corner, there is an image after he had been attacked by the Jordanian immigrant. And so a lot of chaos ensues, obviously, so they rush him off. He does later die from his wounds. Nixon wins with 56.1% of the electoral vote, so a decent amount of the electoral vote that he takes away. But again, the fact that there are multiple candidates running and in the race meant that it was going to be harder to gain a heavy majority in the election. Okay, for ping pong diplomacy, we are going to be looking at this story. Okay, so follow along with me as we go through. So it's called How Ping Pong Diplomacy Thawed the Cold War. So little did you know, relations between the United States and China at this time were due in part thanks to ping pong. Okay, so what had been happening is that Mao Zedong had had his revolution in China, so now China was communist, so they would be allied and friends with the USSR. However, some of their relations kind of weren't working out, and so China was looking towards making better relations with America. But America at this time is not going to diplomatically recognize China because of their communist views. So America disagrees with how Mao went about things and didn't like the way that citizens were being treated under him. Although through propaganda, China was making it look as though Mao was not doing these things. So where we pick up our story, if you look here, I have some main things highlighted or bolded on our document. I will actually also upload this to Axis so that you can see it whenever you'd like to go back and read through this. Okay, this is also found through history.com. So a few places to locate this information. So we have to think back, okay, Cold War spans a lot of time. We have to keep thinking Cold War, tensions over communism versus democracy. Okay, so the US and China had not met, they had met on the battlefield during the Korean War or conflict. Think about the fact that China is communist, so which side would they be supporting? Okay, North, hopefully that's what you thought, right? North communist at this time. Korea still being communist today. But no official American delegation, so group of people, had gone over to People's Republic of China in over 20 years. And that's because of the fact that they weren't recognized diplomatically. So if a country isn't recognized diplomatically by the United States, they're not going to do really any dealings with them. Okay, so finally, President Nixon, he's recognizing that China is a big player on the world stage. And so he makes a statement, we simply cannot afford to leave China forever outside the family of nations. Meaning, okay, all these nations need to work together cohesively. Yes, they're all run on very different views, and America tends to want to only recognize and really heavily help those that hold democratic ideals. We saw that all the way back with imperialism in the early 1900s, how the United States was going to willingly stretch out a hand only to countries that were willing to adopt Western democratic ideals. Okay, this image is going to become important, so go ahead and take a look here. You're seeing the contrast, right? Clearly very American, and in the 1970s, right, we're thinking about hippie counterculture, okay? And you can tell by his shirt, right, that that's kind of where he's going. And so we're going to talk about him in a moment. So what essentially happens is that there is a World Table Tennis Championship going on, and it's actually happening in Japan. The United States sends a team over, and little does he know, but this 19-year-old, okay, Glenn Cowan, he's ultimately going to really lead to a thaw in relations between China and America. Okay, he actually hops on a tour bus that happens to be the Chinese team's tour bus. Okay, so they kind of look at him with suspicion, right? He stands out. He's wearing this straw hat. He's got this shirt that has a peace sign on it. Okay, so they're not going to be, the Americans weren't really coordinated in a uniform. He hops on and it says a bus carrying the red-shirted Chinese national team. Okay, so they're all very official, right? They have a uniform in the United States, a little bit less on the official side for their team. So these two players, he interacts with another player on the bus and they actually exchange gifts. So the Chinese player, he gives him a silkscreen picture, okay, of a mountain range in China. And then later, Cowan actually gives up his shirt that has a peace symbol on it and also has the lyrics of the Beatles songs Let It Be. Okay, so this exchange of two very different things. So you're bringing in definitely Western and American culture, well, British culture as well, right, with the Beatles, but something that is definitely involved in the hippie counterculture. Okay, a little bit of background on this though. So from the Chinese player's perspective, all of a sudden this American hops on their bus, but they've been told don't talk to the Americans. Okay, it was that they were supposed to not talk to them. They had strict orders. Kind of similar in a sense, maybe it's not a one-to-one, but how North Korean athletes in the Olympics were not really able to have much contact with people. That's on a very, very extreme side of things. China was allowed to have contact with other countries, just not America at this time. And so then this is a really interesting quote. So now Mao, he learns of the gift exchange between the two table tennis players. And he basically now says, oh, guess what? The table tennis player from China, Zhang Zedong, he's not just a table tennis player, he's actually now acting as a diplomat. So what you're seeing is that these people that aren't diplomats, they're actually helping out with politics better than some of the politicians are able to. So a big thing that shocks the world is Mao actually invites the whole American team to tour China. So nobody had gone behind the curtain in China, and this was a really big deal. Okay, so later, this is what President Nixon writes, kind of a similar idea to what Mao Zedong was thinking. And so he says, I had never expected that the China Initiative, so working with China, would come to fruition in the form of a ping pong team. So he's just clearly surprised, right? It wasn't diplomacy like normal. So here you have a picture of the table tennis players now helping one another. Okay, so they're actually being trained by the Chinese table tennis players. So the historic visit takes place in 1971, April of 1971. The American table tennis team, they were made up of a lot of players from all over different walks of life. And so they go, and only a few days later, they'd inadvertently become the most important American diplomats on the planet. So even though, right, that's not what they're trained in, they're over there to play ping pong, they are actually now being viewed as diplomats. Okay, so again, they cross into the bamboo curtain is what it was termed in the United States. So think about similar to the Iron Curtain that descended in the USSR, preventing people from getting in, also in Berlin, right, with the wall actually being put up, the Berlin Wall. Okay, so they go and they travel over. They're actually treated very, very well. So they're treated as though they were dignitaries, like they were actually diplomats. They're treated to banquets and big meals. Ironically, though, right, you're still going to see a contrast. The fact that Mao Zedong, his pictures are going to be everywhere. So typically, if you remember back to your freshman studies or European studies with the rise of dictators, to keep themselves in power, propaganda is a big tool. And so Mao Zedong's posters would be everywhere in China. They would have things that were encouraging people to be pro-China, and even blaring military music seemed to be everywhere. So a very different experience than Americans are going to have, right? We don't necessarily always see pictures of our president, but in China, it's going to be much more of that influence. And one of the ironic things that a player saw was that there was a Welcome America team, right? Welcome to the American team. And this banner had been hung over a wall that had these words painted on it. So it had said, down with the Yankee oppressors and their running dogs. Okay, so the Chinese clearly showing on that wall, right, against America. But then ironically now they're putting this big poster across to try to kind of show what is changing. Here on the left, you see this image of the players with their leader here, okay, with their coach. So they're visiting the Great Wall of China. They also participated in a ping pong match just against the Chinese players. So they're in China. The Chinese team also comes and they play with them, and it's an exhibition, and it's called Friendship First and Competition Second. In that, the American team is not the best table tennis playing team. China is much better than them. And so they play this in the spirit of sportsmanship, and China will yield a game or two to America for the sake of diplomacy and just showing that relationships are being thawed. Okay. So finally, this is the big thing, right? Now you're actually having the two leaders of the country meet. So President Nixon ends up going over to China, and that is a big deal because previously to this, they finally kind of start to ease trade embargoes and travel bans. So they had been restricting travel to and from China for certain reasons, and they'd also been preventing any trade from coming in and out of China and America to one another. And so then the big deal is when President Nixon, so back up to reference this picture, President Nixon goes and visits, and he is the first president to ever go visit the Chinese mainland. And so that is a big step, not only just diplomatically, but then specifically in this time of Cold War, to kind of show that the two countries are trying to have better relationships. Okay. So at the end of the day, right, we can really wrap this up with this last thing. We started all the way at the top talking about ping pong, and then by the end, we get to the fact that the President of the United States is visiting China as the first president to have done that in history. So we've gone from a ping pong player, a 19-year-old, who literally then all of a sudden results cause and effect. You can read through this whole article, skim it again, read the bold, right? Cause and effect of the fact that now, due to this 19-year-old, the president is now showing up in China. So that is a very big deal. So if we go back to our slide over here, so we've taken a look at ping pong diplomacy. Okay, we're going and taking a look back here. We're going to look at something called real politics. So what that is politics based on practical objectives rather than on ideals. So typically right now at this time, and again, even going back to imperialism, the United States conducts diplomacy with a lot of countries based on if they're willing to adopt certain Western or democratic ideals in their country. So what America does in this point is recognizing economically they need to start opening up trade and relations with China. And so President Nixon is now going to start making political decisions based on the interest of the nation rather than trying to hold tried and true to ideals. Seems contradictory. Typically, you're told stick to your ideals when it comes to countries working with one another and the economy. Sometimes it needs to be what is best for the economy. So realpolitik in action is just this fact that Nixon dealt diplomatically with China, even though they were a communist nation. So wrapping this all up, looking at this image, okay, this is representing realpolitik because although China was not recognized diplomatically, President Nixon is sitting there with Mao Zedong. So why is this a big deal? What we're seeing right here is the United States dealing with China because they know that it's in the best interest of the nation to go ahead and start to really thaw those relationships with China. Okay, so that wraps up what's called ping pong diplomacy. So this is something you can be quizzed on. Make sure you're looking for a study guide as well as working on any other assignments that you've been assigned and keeping up on the work that you have on our new online learning. Okay, so I will see you back here at some point for our next lesson.